Episode 102, April 10 till 14, 1915. A gallant Turk in defeat. Germans' memory of Mesopotamia. By Edgar Stern-Rubarth. Read by Michel Admiraal. I was sent over to Turkey in October 1914. A few days before her official declaration of war had been made. It was some sort of a favor granted to me for a daring scheme which I had planned to blow up the Suez Canal, and which had been cancelled when Turkey officially joined the German-Austrian alliance. On my journey, I had to smuggle a band of Mohammedan prisoners of war, taken at the French front, through an unfriendly Romania disguised as a circus troupe. It took a long time before our expedition reached the Mesopotamian front, where we had to fulfill a number of delicate and dangerous tasks. It was, however, practically impossible to get a free hand from Turkish headquarters, who were afraid lest the activities of unbelievers on holy soil would spoil their shaky relations with the Arab tribes. We were, therefore, officially embodied in the Iraq Army, my commander as chief of the army's supplies and halting places, my dozen comrades in similar inoffensive capacities, and myself as a ADC to the army's transport section. In fact, we acted as a sort of general staff and were entrusted with the most difficult and sometimes apparently possible tasks. The commander-in-chief, Suliman Ascari Bey, a hero of the Tripoli and Balkan Wars, and a close friend of Enver Pasha, a young and daring soldier, had been seriously wounded during one of the earliest phases of the British attack by a shell smashing his right knee. Medical science would not make him walk again, but Surgeon Major Dr. Eddy Schacht, my comrade who had been made chief of the Army's medical department when we took over its commissariat, restored him as far as possible, and he had a stretcher made for himself which could be erected into a chair. A slightly ridiculous and at the same time pathetic contraption of wood and red plush. Since in November 1914, the British Army under General Barrett had taken Basra and advanced to Kurna, where, according to the Arabs, the Garden of Eden was situated. Suliman Ascari had had reports from the front according to which the Arab tribes, faithful to the Sultan Caliph, were expecting a Turkish counterattack. The frequent skirmishes with the enemy, in which only small Turkish detachment took a hand, had no effect on the situation. The Ch16 therefore decided upon a great attack to force the British forces to withdraw to the Persian Gulf and also to convince the Arabs of the valor and the courage of the Turks. This, at the same time, would rid him of the permanent menace of a British breakthrough at Kurna, where the mines constructed by my comrade Lieutenant Müller and launched on the river again and again with great bravery had thus far been the principal means of defense against the British armored craft. Suleiman's scheme was to turn the British left flank and to march through a 100-mile stretch of desert south of the vast swamps of the Khor Hamar. That march alone would have been a masterstroke for a perfectly equipped army with a well-organized commissariat. For the available force of 12,000 men, with 36 antediluvian guns and practically no means for transport of ammunition, food, sanitary equipment, forage, and even water, was a scheme bordering on folly. In numerous deliberations, we tried to bring home these difficulties, and especially the fact that everything had to be carried with the army, as no means for a line of communication with its base existed. But Suleiman had only one answer. If we fail, the Arabs will say maktub. It has been written. But if we neglect to try, they will take us for cowards and go over to the enemy. So we simply had to attempt a decisive victory within 3 days, which would permit us to live on the conquered forts or city, or to look forward to complete destruction. We were in no triumphal mood when we inspected the army finally assembled in Nigire, at the last bend of the Euphrates before it joins the Tigris at Korna, and dined with the Ch16 for the last time in his tent. I made a sketch of his expressive, if pock-marked face, and he signed it with a few words in Turkish. If you should survive, he said to me, when handing it back, please hand that sketch to my friend Enver Pasha with my compliments, and tell him that I tried to the last to do my duty. When I said something cheerful words, he smiled. I'm not afraid, my friend, but I'm not going to outlive a defeat which will cost me my army. There was, however, a slight chance of success, for the British had thus far neglected the desert north of Basra and only fortified some old strongholds 5 miles north and northwest of the city, at Shwaiba and Zubair. Our regular army, which was to be strengthened by some 18,000 to 20,000 mujahideen, religious volunteers of the Bedouin tribes, as soon as the scene of the battle was reached, consisted mainly of one Anatolian infantry regiment, a battalion of militarized Istanbul Fire Brigade, a battalion of Osman Sheikhs, excellent volunteers from the former Turkish parts of the Balkans, and about 7,000 Arab recruits, mostly ill-trained under Turkish officers. The artillery consisted of 3 good, if not entirely new, German 15-centimeter howitzers, 3 batteries of German field guns of medium caliber, and a number of older pieces. My comrade, Captain Ut, was made artillery commander, but was disabled at the beginning by a severe attack of typhoid fever. To make things worse, our 3 modern howitzers were more or less ruined when tried out near Nashire, with Bulgarian ammunition captured during the Balkan War. Our advance started on April 10, 1915. It took, for the bulk of the army, 3 days. On the 12th, the minarets and the palm trees of the promised city appeared in a blurred mirage on the horizon, and the first skirmishes of advance guards, which had arrived on the previous afternoon, and enthusiastic Bedouin partisans against British troops, echoed in irregular volleys over the endless plain. Suliman Ascari, aided by his Turkish chief of staff, Ali Bey, revised the plan of his attack and selected a spot some 8 or 10 feet higher than the rest of the plain, amongst a few shrubs of tamarisk and his conning tower. He had travelled in an old Viennese cab arranged so that his stretchers could be easily moved in and out. On that bed of suffering he sat, a queer, pathetic figure, watching and directing the procedure. A battalion of valiant, sturdy soldiers attacked the most advanced British fortification. unofficially supported by the gunfire of the Turkish batteries, which were themselves soon located by the longer-ranging artillery of the adversary. Barely 1,000 Osman Sheikhs courageously pushed on the barbed wire fences and obstacles in their way, disregarding the toll that the guns and the machine guns extracted in their loose-knit rows. Always the goal, the fort in their eyes. And then, when they finally reached it, their primitive scissors proved insufficient for cutting the wire. Good 3-string British make, for which the Turkish arsenals had not prepared them. They ran into landmines which blew them up by the dozen, hanging in the air like gigantic bunches of grapes. Meanwhile, with a far away angry noise, the Mudahijin, the tribesmen volunteers, drove hundreds of bellums, long slender boats somewhat resembling the Venice gondola, down the vast lazy river, with a view to attacking the British forces from the rear. But neither the scheme nor their weapons were efficient enough to create as much as a serious diversion from the front, which in the meantime had rapidly developed into a real battlefield, such as would have delighted the heart of every classroom strategist of 50 years ago. For there was a cavalry detachment attacking with lances here, and a little mound captured by infantry in long, loose waves there, a bayonet fight near the barbed wire fortifications, and a precise but ineffectual gunfire at another spot. And all that was visible from one point, the Turkish sea in Sea Hill, whither ADCs, Turks and Germans came and went in haste, bringing information and taking orders, and where a disabled man sat in a red plush chair. The precise British war reports registered the single events of this great fight, but I'm afraid these were somewhat obscure for both sides on the spot, and especially so for the Turks and their leader who, with his field glasses, saw everything as if in a mirage. Indeed, there was a dancing mirage. The cupolas and the minarets of the far-away city, the ships on the water of the Sat el-Arab in the background were sometimes visible above a hazy-crowned fog at an unnatural angle, and advancing troops were blurred out until they suddenly appeared nearly in front of us. The Bedouins, who like skirming and are not afraid of a number of noisy volleys, were not accustomed to gun and machine gun fire. Perhaps they had sized the situation rapidly enough with that intuition given to primitive people. In any case, on the morning of the second day of the great battle, they had disappeared, all but Sheikh Ayami Bey, supreme chieftain of the Muntafik, with about 1,000 or 2,000 of his faithful followers, better armed than the rest of the volunteers, who had come with guns of all ages and makes, often with no more than 1 or 2 dozen rounds of ammunition, and no possibility of replacing the special make long saved for the great day. Ajami, subsequently made Pasha by the Sultan, was a youngish, enthusiastic leader, well informed about the things of the world. He was keen on going, after the successful end of the war, which should stabilize and increase the comparative freedom of the Arabs under Turkish rule, to Istanbul and Berlin, in order to speak to the Kaiser and Hindenburg, and to see for himself the miracles of the Zeppelin and the big Bertha. He fought finely with his well-mounted tribesmen until the end, and cursed the cowards who had deserted the cause of the jihad. the Holy War, in order to watch our line of retreat and to plunder the remainder of the Turkish armor should it be beaten. Notwithstanding some local successes, Zubar and the ruins of Old Basra taken the first day were held, one against evidently increasing Anglo-Indian reinforcement. The second day of the battle seemed to spell disaster. The Turkish trenches, extremely poor lines dug about 20 to 30 inches deep in the crumbling soil, often with a knife or a bayonet, as a few spades were available, were swept by a heavy and persistent artillery fire. Our guns could not reach their batteries. Indeed, it was feared that a number of the armored gunboats from Kurna had been called down and, unseen and out of Turkish range, were playing havoc with us. Our ammunition was running low. The artillery commander got into trouble when Suliman each time the Ch16 ordered an intensification of the fire. He had already lost 2 mountain guns, which had to be abandoned. Once a large British force tried to outflank us and was beaten back with heavy losses on our side, their machine guns outnumbering ours many times, and again brave Turkish infantrymen, especially the Osman Sheiks and the Pompiers, broke forward in desperate attempts, not at breaking the enemy lines, but at getting at them. The first named battalion made not less than 7 bayonet attacks, each time falling back after the loss of more than 1/3 of its remaining strength, until finally only a few handfuls, all wounded, were left at the last storm and taken prisoner by the enemy. I was told, but unable to verify, that the British commander had sent them back under a white flag with his compliments. He did not want to make prisoners of such brave soldiers. During all that struggle and the forced march from Nashire, the army had nothing but beksemet, crude, hard Turkish ship's biscuit, chups, the soft flat cakes of coarse millet which the natives bake on the heated mud walls of a hole in the ground, and a few handfuls of dried dates, washed down with the brackish water carried from the swamps. And even these poor means of sustenance could but last until the 3rd day. But Suliman, when it had been my duty to make that clear to him, said, soldiers can go hungry for days if it's that what gives them victory. We have done it before, in Tripoli, at Kirk Kiseli, at Gumul Jina, and elsewhere. What finally brought about the catastrophe, when the Turkish army had more than held its own and indeed won a number of local advantages, was the complete falling off of our artillery. On the 3rd day, in the early afternoon, the commander informed Suliman that, having fired his last shell, he intended to withdraw his guns, horses, carriages, as to save them from being captured without a shot. Suliman was furious and desperate. Taking the guns back would discourage the army and make it impossible to go on with the fight, which, as the British in 3 days had not been able to repulse the attack, might still be victorious. But he had to give in to the arguments of his subordinate. When clenched teeth, he sat in his chair, a 10-shot Mauser in his fist. Whenever and wherever he discovered in the vast plain around him a soldier in retreat, or seemingly willing to benefit by the withdrawal of the artillery in order to save himself, he shot him. It must have cost him a terrible effort to realize finally that he was at his wits' end, and that to go on attacking the enemy many times stronger than himself, entrenched behind improvised fortifications, disposing of ample guns and ammunition, and backed by a fleet of armored gunboats, would have been sheer madness. And so shortly before the sunset of April 14, the third day of the battle, he ordered the general retreat. 2 of my comrades were with him at that fateful moment, a young, daring cavalry lieutenant and an elderly trooper who had seen the Herero and the Boer Wars in South Africa and had risen from their ranks. They had acted as his orderly officers, and when he had his stretcher taken into the car and drove away to the northwest, they mounted their horses and followed the cab at gallop. And none of them knew that General Mellis, the British commander under General Nixon, had practically at the same moment ordered the breaking off of the battle. And only when his scouts reported the general retreat of the Turks, had given the counter order and engineered a half-hearted pursuit. A mile or 2 from the battlefield, the 2 Germans, who had fallen a little behind with the car, in which the unhappy Turkish commander sat alone and brooding, heard a shot. Rapidly pushing up the sides of the car, they saw Suliman Ascari sitting in his chair, his smoking Mauser still in his right hand, and a thin stream of blood trickling from its forward sunken head. He had done as he had foretold but a week before in his tent at Nessire. His hastily prepared grave is somewhere in the dreary desert south of the Khor Hamar, sun-stricken, wind-swept and unmarked, only a little distant from the paradise of the Turks' imagination. I brought, as promised, the portrait I had drawn of him to his friend and chief Enver Pasha, whom a similar fate befell a few years later. But many more fights and adventures intervened between the battle of Ch16 and my coming back to Istanbul. 5,000 of our 12,000 regular troops did not return, fallen on the field, or died from wounds, hunger, thirst, and the fatigues of the retreat, of treacherously murdered by the deserting tribes for their scanty belongings, a gun, ammunition, a pair of shoes, perhaps a horse shared by 2 or 3 of the wounded, exhausted men. Notwithstanding many brave deeds, the destruction of the Anglo-Persian pipelines by 2 of my comrades at the time of the battle, later on the Turkish victory at Ch16 and the siege of Kut al-Amara, the fate of the Mesopotamian campaign had been sealed at his Turkish Marne.
Shouting out these pathetic